Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm Heather Bernt-Santy. I'm a little rusty. I can't even remember the last time I recorded an episode. So we'll see how this goes. But we've got a great topic and smart people here. So with me today, you guys know Mike Huber. Hi, Mike.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, good. And then we have a special nerd guest. Cayley Burton is here, and we're going to talk about an article that you wrote, Cayley, and I'll jump into that. But first, I want to let you tell folks about yourself. What do you want them to know?
Hey, thanks, Heather, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to be here today. I guess what I want folks to know about me is I wear a few different hats in early childhood education. So I'm an advocate for children's rights, and in particular around gender. And I also am an educator. I work with children of all ages, children who are in preschool and daycare, but I also do one-on-one teaching right now in English, French, and drama and math, all
Wow.
the way up to grade 11. So yeah, I work with all different age groups. And last year I graduated from the University of British Columbia with my master's of early childhood education. And so the paper that we're going to be talking about today was a project that I did while I was at UBC. And it was just in a course, actually. It wasn't my thesis or anything like that. We just did a giant research project for a class. So yeah, so
Fun.
that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thank you. So your article is called "This is a Different Kingdom: A Case Study of Gender Creative Feminine Expression During Princess Play." So I'm going to do a quote here in a second to start the real conversation. But Mike, can I ask you to talk about, because you're the one who connected
Yeah.
Cayley with and I for this episode. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what
Yeah.
why'd you
Well,
do
so
that?
yeah, I know. What was I thinking? Well, in my new book, I'm talking a lot about pretend play, and especially when children take on roles of power. Um, and I, of course, started writing. Well, they asked me to write about gunplay, so that's where I was starting from. And I see in gunplay, even writers I really like Nancy Carlson Page and Diane Levin and things, they would talk about the simplistic, like gunplay when kids are just basically, I guess, using um, Kaylee's wording, they'd be using gender confining expression. And I didn't buy it because, all the work I've done on rough and tumble play, I'm like, oh, you're just looking at any play that's just physical without words as being all the same, rather than looking at it as what are they doing differently over time? How are they learning the vocabulary about physical expression? And so when I was reading this one, and I've always also, had trouble with princess play over the years. Like it was hard for me to see that. And this article really helped me understand it, even thinking about the way, like, there's this thing about like dressing up. All they do is put on a dress like the princess. And it's like, wait, dressing up, that's creativity. Like, why is dressing up and accessorizing not creativity, but, drawing a picture or painting a picture is? So it was an article that really connected things for me. And so yeah, I was immediately like, okay, I want to know more. And also I do work with trans and non-binary children and youth. So there's also the thing of, okay, she works with, children's rights around gender, and so do I. So there was also that. So it's like I have to reach out. And the podcast is always a great, in some ways, the people I meet are often through the podcast. So
I know, right?
more than anything, I just wanted to hear what Cayley had to say.
Yeah.
And
I just keep doing the show to make more
share it with everyone
friends.
else.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk more with both of you about these topics. Yeah, especially because of the book that you're planning. Mike as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me do the quote so we can start having our conversation.
Okay.
This is from the introduction section. So of course there's a little bit that's come before. But you say, for this reason, the majority of the available research on princess play is obsessed with chronicling the restrictiveness of this game, especially when it comes to girls developing perspectives on gender roles and femininity. Yet childhood play is as diverse as childhood gender expression, a nuance that is problematically absent from the pre-existing literature on princess play. So you can take that and start wherever you'd like to talk about this process and what you are thinking about, and we'll jump in.
Yeah. So I wrote this article 3 years ago, and it's interesting to have it resurface with Mike reaching out fairly recently, because I kind of set it aside. Like, I don't know, you're both writers as well. So, you know, when you write your work, but then it's hard to go back and look at it again later. So this was a good opportunity to go back and think about, like, has my perspective changed? Has my pedagogy changed around this stuff? And also I just did a quick bit of research to see if anything new has come out of the field on the topic. And there's actually one article I just want to mention because I think it's important. I said that they were one of the research teams that was only talking about the problematic aspects of princess play, and it's the Coyne et al. Article that came out in 2016. But that research team released 2 more articles, one in 2021 and one in 2023, with the same participants, actually. So they did a longitudinal study, and they went back to the same children 5 years later, and their findings actually show something different. So the first article said it's negative. It's princess play is having a negative impact on children's conceptions of gender. It's reinforcing gender binaries and basically only giving children a very restrictive idea of what girls are and can be. And that's to the exclusion of any other genders being allowed to play in that way. But now the research is showing, in the longitudinal research, that actually being able to explore princess play early on in a child's life can have some positive impacts in adolescence, and that it's helping children think more about what are some of the words that they used? It's giving girls a chance to become a protagonist and define their own stories. And they reference Moana and Elsa, actually, as key to this. And then also for boys, they're saying that their findings show it's helping boys to do a better job expressing their emotions and maybe not jumping immediately to violent ways of problem solving. So that's kind of interesting to think about as well. Because of the violence piece there, I actually kind of want to talk a bit about gunplay, if that's okay. Because I have had a lot of complicated feelings around weapons as well, but children, they love to play with weapons, and they love to make weapons, and they like to enact it. And I think in some ways, like, play is an exploration of these things in a safe way. Like, it's pretend. Like, we don't have to. I know it can go too far and we can cause harm in our play as well, but if they're given the space to act that stuff out, it might help them later not need to express that violence in the same way, or try something on, right? Like, that's the whole point of a costume, is we're trying on these ideas, seeing what fits. Do we like it? Those kinds of pieces, right?
Yeah, I was just writing today about that exact thing, that children have fears and we like to pretend they don't. And then they get to take on these roles and talk about where they don't have to be afraid. They have these roles that are, powerful. And in our society, they kind of get the basic idea of, yep, the way I'm powerful if I'm a boy, and this is going very binary here, is, strength, which people often do talk about kids, how strong they are, But, and then of
Not
course,
necessarily in a super sincere, authentic way, though.
that's true.
Right.
That's true. But sometimes, yeah, no,
Yeah.
but they say it like
Yeah.
it's pulled out as being important.
Mhm.
You know, and then the idea of weapons, of course, being that way. And then, you know, with girls, it's often like, look how pretty you look today, you know, and that the emphasis is often on clothing. And then we're surprised that they think of clothing as being their power,
Mhm.
and they can see society, you know, they're not dumb.
Right.
And so it's like their way of, they get to actually play with fear, you know,
Yeah.
in a way that they don't have to be immersed in it. They and pretend you have the feelings. That's the biggest piece.
Yeah.
That there is a bit of excitement, a bit of, you are a bit scared while you're playing. It's a thing we forget as adults. So they get to experience fear to a certain degree, but in this way that they can step out of the play if it gets too much.
Yeah.
And that's where weapons play and princess play and all sorts of play, like, that's the power in it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, sorry, I'm tangled up in my headphone cord, but I think I've got it now. Both of these aspects, both princess play and gunplay, are things that I've changed my mind about over the course of however many years I've been doing this. But I was thinking about this, both of them. I have also like been talking about how my mind is changing, but my actions weren't necessarily catching up, or there'd be like, well, I don't feel like having this conversation with the other grownups in the room, so I'm going to say no to this today. But princess play is harder for me than gunplay, I think. And maybe it's because I'm a woman, and you know, a feminist and all those things. But the more I thought about it after after we started emailing and then I read this article, um, I couldn't come up with a time when I saw any child dress up as a princess or be pretending a princess role who the pretend play was, I'm going to wait here to be saved. And I think that's part of the fear, right? We're
Right.
afraid that they're learning to be helpless damsels in distress or whatever, but they're not. They're running the show and they're setting the roles and they're talking about all the things they can do. And so it's really like you say in the article, it's a lot more complicated than we think it is or have thought it is. And even the literature review you did here showed that that's really the prevalent idea, is that it's oversimplified, and it's you're either powerful or not, or you're either creative or you're not, or you're a boy or a girl, even in some of this stuff.
Yeah. I think this is why it's so important to do research with children when it's possible, because like the research process, inviting children into it is actually it's so much fun. Like every time I've got to do it, like they're so curious about the actual steps involved in creating research. And often I'll frame it as like, oh, you're helping me with my project.
Yeah.
It's my big project on this topic. And even if they don't care about the topic, they're still so interested in like, okay, so I said, yes, you can record me, but like, what are we still recording? And then they like, make all of these weird noises, and it's lovely. Or like one of the things that I find so endearing about reading that article is I let the children choose their pseudonyms, and they're totally ridiculous names. But what's the harm in that? Like it's what was important to them at the time. And it's just so lovely to draw them into that process, because when we let children actually share their narratives with us, like their play narratives or just their perception of the world, like it is very different than what we often assume as an adult. And even as an adult who's trying very hard to stay connected to, our inner child. You did a podcast with Kisa Marks, and she said that she tries to teach from a place of her inner little girl. And that really stuck with me, because as a researcher or an educator, like that's just such a beautiful starting place, right? And so even as someone who's mindful of those kinds of things, we still bring all of our adult assumptions into our teaching, into our observations with children. And that's why, you know, when I see kids playing princess, it's less about them performing the game. That's usually, there's a lot of layers to it, but the piece that I still find a lot to be concerning is the exclusionary politics
Right.
around it. So that's the part that I get more uncomfortable with.
Yeah. So will you talk about that a little bit? Will you get us
Sure.
started on that one, on that
Yeah.
line?
Yeah, just the way that kids only will let certain other kids play with them when they're doing princess play. I can't speak as much to gunplay, but I have seen it happen as well. But the way that only certain types of kids are allowed to engage in it. And I mean, there's lots of research that supports this as well. Like, we can have an inclusive environment in early childhood education. We can say the kitchen areas for everybody, the block centers for everybody, the dress up areas for everybody. But in practice, who's actually accessing those materials, and which children let other children play with them in those spaces? And I think princess play is still a very gendered type of play in that sense. Like, which boys, which non-binary children feel confident enough to go over there and say, I'm going to wear this dress and be like accepted by their peers. Like, there's so many social dynamics that would have to be in place for that to be a safe thing to do.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I definitely have seen this too. And it's been so interesting because as much as, well, I'll bring up one child I had decades ago. I don't exactly know, like, I haven't talked to the child since, you know, they would be around 30 now. So I have no idea what they're doing, but they were assigned male at birth. They had really short hair, but then they always wore this like sequined skirt on their head that, you know, went down. So it had this flow, and they held a Barbie doll in one hand all the time. And what I found so interesting was that their mom had really short cropped black, you know, hair. Their grandma had really short cropped hair, and but still, you know, they knew, you know, I'm a girl, I have this long hair, right? I think they would say they were a Barbie. I don't think they ever said they were a girl. They never said they were a boy either, but they always said they were.
It was Barbie.
Yeah. And I just found it so interesting the way that would work. But then one time there were kids playing, and they were in like this little, like, it had been a closet and we had taken the doors off. So it was just this little nook. And they were not letting another kid in, and said, well, only girls can come in here. I don't think it was specifically princess, but it was like, only girls can come in here. And this child, the Barbie, was in there. And somebody said, but they're in there and they're a boy. And this other girl, you know, 4 years old, just said, no, I have seen their true self, and they are a girl.
Oh, wow.
And it was like, oh, okay. You know, and it was just so interesting to me. And that was, well, I know it was in the mid 90s. So I was early in my journey of understanding, you know, certain non-binary identities or not, you know, whatever non-binary, not necessarily as its own identity, but just identities that don't quite fit. So, but I just found it so interesting that 4-year-old was probably right, closer to the truth than anybody else. But I just found it so interesting that exclusion thing was still there. It's just that they, you know, the Barbie child was included because they were not considered a boy. And another child who's trying to come in who they considered a boy was not. So it's still exclusionary, even though they're being inclusive in one way. So I don't know.
Yeah,
it's like everything's a continuum. Even inclusion. It's like even inclusion is a continuum.
Well, and it's one thing to like look at that moment for sure, but then like children have so many interactions throughout the day with whoever they're with, right? So but I do find the resistance to be more around boys trying to play princess. And I just in like the trying to like think more about this in anticipation of the podcast, I tried to talk about princesses a bit with a group of 6 and 7-year-olds. And in the article, the older sister articulates really well that there's this idea like you should be growing out of liking princesses by a certain point.
Yeah.
As well. So I thought, okay, I'll ask some 6 and 7-year-olds about it. And they were so vocal about absolutely hating princesses, that they're babyish. And it was like really a strong reaction to me wanting to read them a book that was like also called like Not Every Princess Dresses in Pink. Like it's like this is a gender expansive understanding of princesses. But yeah, it's interesting because when I started to ask them more about like, so let's say, you know, a child, one of your friends wants to play with you at recess, but they want to play princess and they're the same age as you right now. Like, would you play that game with them? Like if they invited you, and they all said no, like they were like, nope, I would tell them that they should go find someone else to play with today. And it's like, oh, okay. So it's not only just saturated with gendered meanings, but it's also on a continuum of age for these kids and maturity, which is
6 and 7 seems so young. I kept connecting this as I was reading it to Barbie play, you know, also because it's had some of the same criticisms. And I think I played with Barbies till I was 14. I would still play with Barbies if I had them in my house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find that interesting too. I interviewed 2 siblings who are now 17 and 20. And the one child like would play, I still remember this. There was a time where these kids were playing Star Wars and another group is playing Princess, and they were both trying to play in the same area. And then Q is the name I use in the book for now, though they're turning 18 before I'm done with the final draft. So I'm going to use the actual name.
Yes.
But they just like suddenly said, I'm Princess Leia and this is Queen Amidala. And we're playing it here. And it was suddenly like, everybody's like, okay, of course. And they identify as non-binary now. And it was so interesting, the interview, because they did sort of identify for a little while as trans. So assigned female at birth, and then were identifying as male, and then eventually came around to non-binary, and but still in theater would only take male roles and things like that. And just this year at 17 took a female role. And they talked about, I realized I don't care. Like I can wear whatever I want to wear. I can take any role I want. It doesn't have to affect me. And it's like, oh, that's kind of what you said to me when you were 4. And you did that. And it was just so interesting. But one of the things that happened was their sister, who was assigned male at birth, would play knight, and the only thing in common they had, the entry point they had to pretending together, was princess and knight. So they'd often play that way. And then the older sister, who is identified as A, so it's Q and A in the book.
Cute.
But they she said that around 9 she was not interested in playing princess anymore. And so they stopped playing together because that was the only thing they had in common. But she started playing Dungeons and Dragons with her father, and then eventually
princess play.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's kind of her point, that once her younger sibling was around 8 or 9 also, then it's like, why don't you try this game instead? And so they still to this day play Dungeons and Dragons. So there was this idea that like princess play was no longer the thing they could do. And it was really interesting that it was the only way they played together, and it just sort of dropped off.
Yeah.
So yeah, the age thing is definitely a part of it.
Yeah. So I wanted to, we've started talking about this without necessarily naming it. But I wanted to ask you, Kate, to talk about just the idea of gender creative princess play. Like, let's if we could unpack that a little bit and talk about,
Yeah.
like I said, it's kind of been part of this
Yeah.
previous bit here, but this feels like a good time to make it sort of explicit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's one of the things that's really, I don't know, I love the idea of just queer as a concept because it's very open-ended and it can be so many things. We don't have to pin it down. But for me in the article, gender creative was basically anything that was unexpected, like either my own biases or what the research had called, you know, this is a thing that princess play must look like in order for it to be princess play. And one of the ways that we were able to become more gender creative was basically by like thinking more like, does it always have to involve costumes? And one of the things that was really interesting with the child that I did the study with was every time we played, I gave her a choice between dress up or these other materials. Like we can wear the princess costumes. And I think I even, you know, was expecting her to choose the costumes because that was something we had done a lot, was dress up and tell various stories. Yeah, where she was either the princess or the queen, and I was usually the villain or the helper. Right. So there's that power dynamic.
Yeah, power reversal.
Yep.
Yeah. But she always chose the other options. So like the first session, we ended up doing Play-Doh, and that was really amazing and really fun. And you know, like the Play-Doh set wasn't necessarily even like designed as like a, you know, a queen and a king, but she created that. That's where the story went. And then one thing I'm finding really useful for gender creative princess play specifically is making crowns with children. So I did that again last week, actually. I read The Paper Bag Princess, which is always a classic, and children seem to really love that story. Children of all genders. And it's funny and it's kind of controversial because in one page she doesn't look like she's wearing any clothes, right? Like they're really interested in this story. And yeah, we made crowns again with the older kids too. And all of them were immersed and engaged in this activity. And one of the things I'm thinking about too is like, why is it the crown that is allowing for such creative gender expression? Like, I'm giving you all the colors to choose from, all the stickers, all the gems, or whatever, you know, materials we have available. But something about the crown is really capturing their expressiveness and their creativity, and it doesn't seem to be as gendered for them as the costumes might be, or anything else like in that same vein. So that to me is gender creativeness, is materials that maybe don't have the same cultural gendered meanings attached to them, so that children can actually pick it up and start to create stories outside of what they've already been told are just for boys and girls. Because it's so hard with the costumes, right? Like even I just think about for the kids who do like Disney, like, but all their classmates are saying, oh, that's babyish. You can't say that you like it then. Like, even if you do, like, you're going to get made fun of possibly. Like, it really depends on the social dynamics to feel comfortable then to be like, but I like wearing a skirt, even though I'm a boy. Or I like princesses. I like Frozen. Like, it's, so I don't know, like there's something there about the actual physical materials that we're providing children in their play, but then there's also something broader around like the social and cultural expectations for children's play that I think can either be restrictive or expansive.
Yeah, one item of clothing that I found kids would use across genders is I get like silk scarves, or you know, not actual silk, but and then just have Velcro in the corners. And some kids would make them into dresses or skirts. And some people would, you know, sort of figure out how to do a head, you know, scarf or whatever, but it was something, and then you could also do it as capes. And it was this thing where it's the same fabric and people could even change in the middle of the game. But that was one of the few things that I also saw, like, kind of everybody would kind of do, that entails, but that gets out of the princess and part of it. But yeah, there's definitely something. The crown thing I find so interesting. Even thinking of Paper Bag Princess, Prince Ronald, I think is his name, is like, that's all he has, a crown. Like everything else is just like guy in 1975, you know. And I just find that funny that it's like, it's still a castle and everything, but it's like he's kind of dressed in, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I find that interesting too. Like, what is it about the markers? And I guess that's part of it too, right? That it's a marker. And thinking of gender expansive teens and young adults, there's often a thought to how many pieces of like accessories do you use that signal to people what gender you want to be perceived as, you know. And it's just so interesting to me that kids, like, it happens earlier than that, which makes sense. Like, we're figuring out our gender schema this whole time. And I know there is, I can't remember the article, but reading someone talking about that age, that, like, I guess 9 or 10-year-old was in the study, but children will choose, they'll perform the way they understand the gender to be. So they had the example of a boy who knows he's not supposed to study or care about school. And the researcher knew that he had studied for 3 hours from the interview. But in the classroom, when the teacher said, "Oh, you did so well, you got everything right," and he made sure to say out loud, I didn't even study for it.
Yeah.
You know, like, he still had to perform that in front of all the kids, even though the researcher knew that's actually not what happened, but he knew what to say or how to perform. And I'm sure the same thing. I definitely remember playing, like, doing pretend play a lot longer than at least I thought my friends were, because no one talked about it. Everyone said it was dumb. But at home, I was certainly doing it. And, you know, my little sister became my, you know, like, playmate, because we could play Barbie still.
Yeah.
Well, had I known you, Heather, we could have
done Barbies together. We still can. I'm not losing hope yet. Next nerd sleepover, big
There we go.
Barbie party. That just reminds me of playing with my brother. He's 6 years younger than I am. So he would have been 5, 6 when this was happening, but he was very into Star Wars. You know, he's a 70s kid. And he had all the little action figures, and I would play Star Wars with him. He really wanted me to play with him, but I would act out very homemaking, caregiving storylines with the characters that were not like Star Wars scripted. And then, you know, so there's this negotiation too sometimes, and you talk about that in the article, that maybe that's where some of the power comes in. I mean, in most pretend play, there's power in that negotiation. But in terms of this princess play, other than the sort of exclusionary negotiation stuff, what else is in your mind when you talk about or write about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess one of the things that I think is important for us to remember as grown-ups is, just because the children are pretending this game doesn't mean that they're going to just choose that thing forever. Actually, I do think maybe it's important for them to play what that gender role, you know, they're being told from media and their culture. That's how we have to do it. And maybe it's good for them to try that on for a little bit. They might discover that they don't like it. Like, it's same as, like, sure, it might feel better to be the one with all the power, like the queen or whatever. But I know afterwards, like, sometimes you want to try not being the queen, because it's a huge responsibility, and
it makes me real tired.
Yeah. And like, it's hard to always be the leader. And I think children also relate to that. Like, even kids I know who are sort of, other children perceive them as the leader and always do what they want to do. They have days where they're just like, I don't want to, like, stop. Like, I just want to read this book, or I just want to sit here by myself. Like, go, like, it's a lot. So I think that's one thing I want us to think about. And you mentioned schemas,
Mhm.
which I have been thinking more about, because part of the reason children are, having fun while they're playing princess, or any of these kind of gendered play games, is because they're exploring that schema, and they're trying to figure out what are the boundaries of this, like with my peers, like how am I being perceived by the grown-ups? And the thing that I've been thinking more about is, like, an educator, I want to teach more queer content, but it's hard sometimes because the kids, the parents obviously can be resistant to it. And then there's a lot of anti-trans policies right now, especially in the States. But how do you be the person to, like, broaden their schema? Like how do we start to, like, make it a bit bigger, create more space? And I think that's the part about princess play that I would like to somehow continue to do and research more with kids, is like, okay, so boys aren't allowed, but how come? Like, what about that is so uncomfortable and so impossible to imagine when this is all pretend anyways? Like, but children have really strong feelings about it. So it really challenges the way that they're coming to understand the world, but I think that's a good thing. It's just hard as a teacher because, like, sometimes it's like, okay, yeah, you feel this way. I'm not going to force you to try this out, obviously. But just what if we do try it out just for a little bit?
Yeah. And I think there's a different, like, it's important to, think about it in terms of, now I can't remember researcher names, but, there's one thought that there's own gender schema, and then you have a superordinate gender schema, like what culture decides. So how you fit in and what's open in society are two different things. And I think maybe that's part of it, right? That I think it's important for kids to hear, all these, that who can be a princess. They still might exclude in the moment in their class because they're figuring out themselves, or they won't try something because they can't do that. But at the same time, I think there's something, and this is more from my own experience talking to people. So one of the whole reason I did the proposal for the book was I'd gone to see Barbie, the movie Barbie. One of the times with a group of trans women, and afterwards I just asked, "Oh, did you play with Barbies when you were a kid?" And the first person said, "No, I played with trucks." And I can't remember, they said three things, or she said three things, and they were all like, she was definitely in a family that, like, she was considered a boy and was raised as a boy and enjoyed the things she played with. But for whatever reason, she knew that there's a, there could be a more expansive, way of finding your gender. And I feel like what I've seen is the people who grew up in more limited views of gender as a whole, of what's open to people, those are the people that think there's something wrong with them because their own gender schema doesn't fit into what they consider culturally okay. And those are the people that it takes years to come out. And people who just see that it's open, it's like, maybe they are cisgender and they're like, "Oh yeah, that isn't me." But maybe they decide, like, yeah, it's not me, but that doesn't mean I can't, paint my nails, or it doesn't mean I can't, like, you can be a little bit expressive when you see that. But I do think that's the thing that we can do even in early childhood, is just always push at, why, why are princesses, or why do you think princesses are only girls or something?
Yeah. Do you think that there might be, and this is just straight from my brain, out of my mouth, but but do you think there's an element of risky play in this conversation? Like, usually we associate that with physical risk. There's like an emotional or a linguistic risk even here sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. Yeah, well, because even like, again, reading this I read 2 books to the kids recently about princesses, but one child noticed between both books, like, how come they're not wearing shoes? Like, and actually, I didn't
Oh,
notice that,
yeah.
but in the illustrations, a lot of these princesses weren't wearing shoes. Like, they
Huh.
were labeled as princesses, but they were barefoot. And that even, like, it's such a simple shift, but I guess princesses always have shoes on or something.
Mm,
But
they must have been witches.
yeah, right? Like, and it was just so interesting to have him notice that. And,
Yeah.
he vocalized that and there was no shame around it. But
Uh-huh.
um, I do think that this is sort of a risk that kids are taking
Mhm.
sometimes. And I
Mhm.
think it depends on the group of children and the kind of conversations that have been happening around gender. Like, kids always say pink is for girls. So are we responding to that when it comes up? Like, pink's for everybody. Like, you don't have
Mhm.
to like pink, you don't have to use pink, but it's actually for everybody. Because kids say these things, and even the broader categorization of, like, teachers still say boys and girls, like,
Mhm.
Mhm.
I do think it's these broader messages they're getting that do make any kind of gender creativity risky for them
Mhm.
socially.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
it can have also physical consequences as well. So, um,
Right.
yeah, so I had never thought about that, but I really like that framing.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't remember what you said, but I like wrote risky play immediately and waited for my opening. Um, so we haven't talked a lot yet about the adults
Hmm.
in this situation. I don't remember if you had other adults working on this research with you, but just in, I guess, processing what you found as you researched, or just our experience working with other adults around children, where does that fit into this conversation? What do we need to talk about adults who are there when this play is happening, or the exclusions are happening, or
Hmm. I did the research mostly by myself.
yeah.
Um, I had my prof helped me
Uh-huh.
with the design of
Yeah.
the project. And
Yeah, it wasn't a
actually,
critique of your
no, no,
methods.
no,
I
I know.
just
I'm just, it was a while ago. And
yeah.
doing your master's during COVID
Oh boy, yeah.
it was so, yeah, a
Yeah.
bit of a blur. But
Yeah.
actually, one thing that I've noticed sort of within myself around this research is sometimes I worry it's not, like, people won't take it seriously. Like, I
Hmm.
feel like Princess Play is just like, oh, what is that? Like,
How cute.
who thinks about
Yeah.
it very much, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, so actually sometimes I find a little bit of a resistance within
Yeah.
myself to admit that I'm interested in this
Hmm.
topic, which is kind of
Well,
weird.
I think that's
Yeah.
the thing, right? That because I think it's connected, right?
Hmm.
Princess play is considered so it's for girls or whatever.
Right.
It's feminine, and
So it has
therefore
to be
it's not,
bad.
and it's not, yeah, it's not serious. It's like rom-coms aren't
Patriarchy.
serious filmmaking. And
Yeah.
just whatever, like
Yeah.
anything that's made just for girls or women is not serious. So
Hmm.
it's like related in a way. And
Hmm.
having to convince other adults, like, hey,
Yeah.
this can be an actual thing.
Yeah. So Stephanie Galloway, who was on the show a month or so ago, wrote a book called Happily Ever Resilient about fairy tales and resilience. And I remember one of the things that she mentioned early in the book is this idea that we've gotten really afraid of fairy tales, even because of gender, you know, portrayals and things like that. And her assertion, hi Stephanie, I know she's probably going to listen, so now I'm all like nervous about whether I'm going to represent her correctly. But just that, there's power in being the princess, even if the princess is very girly, right? Like, to say princess play isn't valuable or isn't powerful exploration, or we shouldn't um support it um because of how it might, socialize
And one
girls
thing she
being
says in
girls,
that,
but some
yeah,
girls are
sorry,
girls. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
some girls are really feminine, and that's
And one thing she says in that book is about like the idea of a framework. I don't think she uses that
yeah.
word, but
I should have grabbed it
Kaylee,
before
you
I
use it
started.
in the article. right? That fairy tales have very generic frameworks. It's often like, okay, if you say witch, you don't have to say anything else about this witch. If you say, like there's these simple things, because then you can lay anything on top of it. And that's similar to Princess Play. I forgot it was Russian authors that were talking about pretend play, but I think that's a big part of it, is that it's simple for that reason. And we get scared of it, but kids are active learners. And again, that gets to exactly what you were saying, Cayley, right? That no, they're going to be creative on top of it.
Yeah.
But it starts from here, and you can look at it with, again, it's Pride Month while we're recording. So, just like, when I watch drag performers, like they start from, here's the view from society. Now I'm going to I'm going to present that in a hyper fixated way, or not hyper fixated, but emphasize it, like exaggerate it. That's the word I was looking for.
That's the word.
There it is. And I think it's so similar to what kids do, whether it's Ninja Turtles or, princesses or whatever. It's like, I'm going to go full tilt on this thing and just go further. And it doesn't mean they're thinking this is the only way to do it, but it is a fun way to present it. But the framework itself is just kind of there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so.
Yeah. And I think, so the role of the adults, I guess, I would go back to the word negotiations, because I think that's our job. So I think, Heather, you share this sort of approach to working with children, but observing first before you intervene.
Try to, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the piece, so while children are young and they're still making sense of the world and still making sense of their own gender and other children's genders, we can help them negotiate that while they're playing. So I don't want to see other kids being excluded. So that's where I would intervene and say, okay, wait a second, our friend would really like to play with you because your game is so fun. Why, let's see what role they can have in the game. It's not a choice for you to exclude this person. That's not allowed right now. They're interested in playing, and we can make this game anything we want. It's a fairy tale, it's a princess land, it's fantasy. So I think that's our job, is to figure out what that negotiation can be, and help the children through that. If they're well, no, he cannot wear a dress. Okay, but he wants to wear a dress. He said he wants to wear a dress in this game. That's allowed. That's totally allowed. And if it makes you upset, we can work through that together. I know those conversations can be really hard and confusing, but it's okay for kids to be uncomfortable with that as well. And that is what we can do, is help them negotiate that. Or today we can have two queens. Sometimes it's just as simple as that, is splitting the power, which is uncomfortable too. Even as grownups, we, power is so complicated, but kids, I think that's it. I think it's the negotiation piece, and they don't have the social skills yet to do that on their own, especially with something as complicated as gender, because it is easy to simplify it, and it does make it way more comfortable for a lot of people. But I am interested in making it as let's complicate that and let's explore what's possible. We can do that together. So that's where I think educators can kind of step in.
Yeah. I think it's hard for a lot of us adults working with young children to accept messiness or accept complication. We want everything to be it somehow, it sort of feels, I think, to some of us, that if we're really experts, we should know what to do in every situation, right? But the expertise comes in the pausing and the wondering and the negotiating.
I'm just going to throw out a book, Nick Taronis's Can of Worms.
Can of Worms, yeah.
I think is such a great way, that's why he really nails that.
Yeah. I think we've done 2 episodes. We did a 2-part thing with that book a couple years ago, if anyone's interested in going back and look. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Messiness.
Yeah. It's a bunch of toddlers hanging out with worms, right? And wondering about, it leads into this gender kind of wondering. And
Yeah, but I don't think we
that's
need,
a super oversimplification. Sorry, Nick.
But it's messy. That's the
Right, it's
main
messy.
it is messy. Yeah, and some parents are gonna get upset.
Mhm,
We're gonna have to have those conversations.
mhm.
I don't know. I don't think we have to be experts. Like, um, I've been teaching, I'm still a pretty new teacher overall. Like I've been teaching maybe 5 years, but um, I have learned that it's actually really useful to just sometimes come back the next day and talk more about it with the
Right.
kids, or, you know, even a few days later, if it's a really difficult dilemma or a
Mhm.
challenge where I just need more time to think about it. But
Mhm.
it seems like the important thing, it's worked for me, is just the coming back to it.
Mhm.
Like
Right.
sometimes kids don't remember, and I'm like, hey, remember when this thing happened the other
Mhm.
day? And they're like, no.
Yeah.
But they're still interested in the
They've lived
conversation.
1,000 lives since
Right.
then.
And you get to model that adults don't always know,
Yeah.
or that ideas aren't that simple, or, you know,
Mhm.
that everything is a little bit messy.
And that their ideas were so interesting to you that you're still
Mhm.
thinking about, even though their ideas were just appearing through that play, not,
Mhm.
you know, them telling you their idea. That's a big piece of this, is that we're paying attention to their ideas and we're taking it seriously.
And in some ways, I think that you know, thinking of queering things, the biggest point of that is, well, some of it's around gender.
Mhm.
More importantly, is the idea of refusing to accept dichotomies,
Yeah.
you know, that no, there's never just one thing or the other. You know, there's a lot of gray area, or, um, you know, oh, you've noticed the girls you know like to do this, but that doesn't mean all girls do,
Mhm.
or whatever, you know, like
Right.
that. It's always important for kids to know that dichotomies don't work. It's where we start, I think, like in the terms of how we sort things in our brain, we often have to categorize, but categories shouldn't um, get away from actually understanding. Because
Mhm.
what happens is we start to think the dichotomy is the real thing, and anything that doesn't fit it is somehow wrong, instead of, oh, my first idea was wrong.
Right.
I have to go back and change that.
But I mean, that's kind of schema learning, right? It's
Yes.
we have this one way of understanding based on what we've experienced, and we experience something outside of that, and suddenly we're thrown for a loop, and we have to figure out what to do with it. And
Everything
sometimes,
falls down. Everything falls down. Oh, that balloon just went up.
yeah.
You
So,
know?
I know. It's amazing.
yeah. Huh.
Yeah,
So, oh, go ahead.
it's not I think too, like it's kind of what you were saying, like it's, if it's gonna get messy, we're gonna need some time. And we don't have to talk about gender all the time. Like either like we can read a book about princesses once in a while, and the kids can get like, ah, that's so, why are you making me read this? But yeah, why do you think I'm making you read it? Like what's so bad about sitting with this for 5 minutes? Like you don't actually have to like it. It's okay. Some people in the room are gonna like it and they've been asking for it or something, right? Like it's sometimes we have to sit in that discomfort. And I think it's good for kids to learn that too. Like it's okay to not like it. You're gonna be all right. And then we'll move on. You know, like especially there's so many good books out there now about this kind of thing, like, you know, trying to complicate and help kids understand like princesses can be whatever you want them to be. The color pink is for everybody. It even represents anti-bullying, right? Like there's just like a lot of different ways we can look at things. And I think that's the important part, is negotiating that with kids, but it takes work and time. So I know it's not.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, we usually don't do it, but can I read a quote?
How dare you? Yes, of course you can.
Well, so I'm going to quote the last sentence in your article. And I know it's been so many years since you wrote it that you don't remember this, but just to show how much you.
But trust us, it's from your article.
But it's true. Yeah, exactly. But you say, By opening ourselves up to children's understandings of their play-based experiences, we begin to see how gender and femininity are in constant negotiation during early childhood, even for princesses. So
Yeah.
look at that.
That's
Um,
nice.
No, it's
Yeah.
brilliant.
That's
I
re-
mean,
that's- well, thank
that's
you.
why.
Yeah.
Yeah, I still feel that way, so that's good.
Yeah.
But to have that consistency, but
Yeah. But you've
Yeah, and
gone further in this discussion that it's also negotiation outside of the play
Yeah.
too.
yeah, and valuing femininity as well, because I know we kind of mentioned that a little bit, but I
Yeah.
think that is wherever feminine expression is coming from, right? Like, can be so many different things. So yeah, thanks for reading that. A good concluding
I
sentence.
was gonna say it's a good place to kind of wrap things up. But I mean, was there anything else you really hoped to get in or talk about, Cayley? Or
No, it's just really wonderful to have the opportunity to talk with both of you
Yeah.
on this kind of topic.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Yeah.
this.
Well, I'm so glad
Yeah, this is great.
you could join us, and thank you for the work you did here with this article, and the work that will continue, I'm sure, as you keep going. And thanks, Mike, for finding it.
Yeah.
Thanks for writing your book too, I guess. This is Cayley. I don't know if you've noticed, I'm not great at wrapping up the podcast. It's time for the awkward wind down.
No,
Okay,
this is great. This is
thank
so
you for
good.
being here. Thanks everybody for listening. Hope you'll come back again for another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd.